The mid-1980s brought about a change in the American video game industry. An industry formerly dominated by North American companies soon found an eastern wind blowing over the United States. While the crash earlier in the decade slowed commercial growth in the sector, it wasn't the desolate wasteland painted by many analysts at the time. The American consumer was ready and waiting. The immensely successful New York launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System demonstrated that there was not only still life in the video game market, but consumers were hungry for new products. The New York launch of the NES directly inspired one man to move forward with a radical new idea in how video games would be played, but also what they would be played on. When Tom Zito noticed in New York a group of teens in a toy store lining up to play Mario Bros. On the NES during its 1985 launch, he observed that the NES was a nice-looking system, but it wasn't the advancement in graphics he was expecting. It was, in his eyes, pretty similar to what Atari had been making earlier in the decade. He thought to himself that there would be a better way to push games further than just the basic sprites of Nintendo. Zito returned to the company he had worked for in California, Axelon, which just so happened to be owned by Nolan Bushnell, the man who founded Atari and practically started the video game craze in North America. Zito pitched his idea to Nolan Bushnell. Zito's idea at its core was a game system that used actual footage as a way to play video games, a marriage of the two mediums, live-action footage and video game graphics. Nolan took Zito aside and told him his idea was basically suggesting they turn their company into a movie studio. Nolan told Zito that in order to pursue this idea, he would have to secure outside funding. Tom Zito estimated he needed around $7 million to launch a console, which Hasbro was willing to float provided they were given full video game rights to the system. Nolan Bushnell agreed to the exchange between Axelon and Hasbro initially, provided he could get arcade game rights to the games produced for the system. However, Nolan was not involved in the day-to-day operations of the console development, so there was a growing disconnect between what he expected from the project and what was actively being developed.
He and I actually ended up on opposite sides of a major boardroom decision. Nolan fiercely wanted the company to put out arcade versions of the games. That certainly worked many times for him. He believed that playing the games in the arcade would get people to buy the home system. I felt that in this case, the opposite was true. My concern was simple. As cool as games were, they had a finite play value. Once a player completed the game a few times, he had seen all it has to offer. You weren't likely to play it again, let alone pay big bucks to play it again at home. Nolan's theory worked for most games, but I was worried that arcade versions would cannibalize console sales. We just didn't have the depth of catalog to pull that off. David Crane, co-founder of Activision, Nemo team member.
Nolan Bushnell saw the Nemo, as the system became called, as a similar platform to his Atari VCS, a system driven by sales of arcade hits. Only the vision that Zito and other Nemo team members had for the system didn't allow for the same type of replayability that Nolan wanted or had experience with. The Nemo titles would have limited replays by design, and that included the type of game Zito was planning on making. Things came to a head between Zito and Nolan when Zito developed the first test game for the Nemo, called Scene of the Crime, which was a multi-camera feed mystery game where the player had to solve who the thief was by watching different rooms and piecing together the mystery. This led Nolan to firing Zito from Axelon. However, Hasbro liked the progress Zito had made, so Hasbro paid off Axelon to bring Nemo directly under its control, and Hasbro created a division called ISIX to continue the project under its guidance and directed by Tom Zito. Nolan Bushnell walked away with a substantial buyout from Hasbro for Axelon's contributions to the project. The technical base for the Nemo came from tech intended for the ColecoVision, because the system was capable of generating game sprites over a transparent background. This allowed for live gameplay animation to be put over video footage or a live video feed, which opened up all kinds of new possibilities. Coleco never used this technology because it was too expensive earlier in the decade, but the Nemo team was able to put this tech to work with what they were planning. Something that truly set the Nemo project apart from other mainstream systems was that Nolan and Zito had made the decision to put the game media on VHS tapes. A few factors drove this decision. The first was that VHS tape production cost was about $1 versus $10 to $30 for a typical game cartridge at the time. The other factor was the Nemo tech that allowed for multi-track tapes with more than one video track. The Nemo could, at the request of the user, change the video track while the game was being played. This made the VHS not only a data storage platform, but a unique media for streaming video along with Coleco tech, allowing for true interaction between the player and the video, at least in terms of preset choices. The first prototype of the Nemo was a ColecoVision with a cable signal streaming to it. The signal was that of an American football match, with graphics overlaid over the top of the game. The game was called Armchair Quarterback. It was meant to demonstrate how the Nemo could be implemented as more than just a singular static game system. The player could predict what the next play would be, and if they got it right, they earned points based on how in sync they were with the quarterback playing at the game. However, the live feed of a sporting event required encoders actually tracking the live stream from the game to output the score data in real time, which was just too impractical for a game system. Ultimately, it didn't matter that Armchair Quarterback was undoable from a financial standpoint. It turned heads and got people thinking about what they could do with this system. The concept of live broadcasts was shelved in favor of games like Scene of the Crime, games that utilized multi-track VHS technology, which allowed for home gameplay that didn't require a team of coders watching a live sporting event. This meant that the team behind the Nemo had to pioneer how interactive games of this kind would play and convey content to the user.
Nobody on the team had any idea what an interactive movie looked like, how it should work, let alone how to go about making one. Tom's approach was classic, designed by committee. We would go around the room and solicit everybody's thoughts, after which Tom would render some sort of verdict.
The VHS format of the Nemo was made possible by interleaving footage on the tapes, compactly storing the visual information in a way that allowed for the system to change footage feeds on the fly, by sending the footage to a video encoder, which was supported by VRAM and an interval encoder that allowed the footage to be actively selected. The technology was coined InstaSwitch. However, that phrase isn't found anywhere in the patents for the Nemo. The Nemo had built its primary game mechanics around the InstaSwitch concept, requiring the games to be precisely timed and limit the possible choices a player could make. Even though those choices were limited, the Nemo allowed for at least 8 potential video feeds for the player to observe, depending on the nature of the game being played.
The toughest part of creating a game like Night Trap was dealing with parallel scripting. Philosophically, there were a bunch of closed-circuit cameras each watching different action. If one person was seen walking from the kitchen to the dining room, that person has to appear in the dining room walking from the kitchen. That was the simplest problem they had to solve. The whole story had to mesh, every track interweaving with each other. Normally in post-production, the director or producer would change a scene's timing to tweak the pace of the story. In this case, a change of 2 seconds in one scene breaks the entire interactive experience. David Crane.
Hasbro was impressed enough with the Nemo that they authorized the creation of 2 games, Sewer Shark and Night Trap. The games cost millions to produce, and were basically a combination of Silicon Valley and Hollywood. The games were produced and ready to launch with the system. But now the Nemo needed a name. The codename Nemo, which stood for Nintendo Ends Mid-October, was coined by Rob Fulop. Or it's been said to mean never ever mention outside, which can be attributed to Stephen Hasenfield, the eccentric chief executive who had a peeve against leaking news to the press about the Project Nemo. The Nemo was eventually given the name Control Vision. Hasbro hired the ad firm Goodby to be the force behind the Control Vision. Goodby is the same firm that would later create the Sega Scream and the Got Milk ad campaigns of the early 90s, which, given the potential of this marketing firm, there's no doubt that this could have been a memorable campaign, which raises really interesting questions as to why the Nemo was cancelled, and what the system could have achieved if it had ever actually come to market. Given that the Nemo had the full financial weight of Hasbro behind it, why did the company eventually dump it and write off the $10 million they had invested in the project? Many individuals today are quick to write off the Nemo, because of their experience with game systems like the Action Max, which was a simple light gun game system that linked with the VHS tape, that had little to no replay value, and the player couldn't lose, they just went through the VHS tape until it eventually stopped and they started over. The Nemo at its core was and is drastically more advanced than that of the Action Max. The combination of game sprite overlays and the InstaSwitch technology allowed for an actual gameplay experience that could allow the player to lose. Although the games I'm talking about are Night Trap and Sewer Shark, these titles, had they been released in 1989, would have been considered a shift in the video game landscape of that decade. What killed the Nemo was ultimately outside of the control of the team making the system and Hasbro. When Hasbro, Axelon, and ISIC started the development of the Nemo, VRAM chips, which made the gameplay on the Nemo possible, were around $30 a chip. When the Nemo was about to hit the finish line and go into full production, that changed. The cost of VRAM inflated to $80 a chip because of a failed trade agreement between the United States and Japan, along with potentially questionable business practices by chip manufacturers drove up the cost. Because the Nemo relied heavily on VRAM to make the system work, it was impossible to keep costs down. With the increase in VRAM cost, the system's price jumped to well over $300. Hasbro's goal was that the Nemo would be the Nintendo killer, and it had to hit the market at around $100. If they couldn't achieve that goal, it was simply too risky for Hasbro. Even with 250,000 pre-orders of the Nemo by retailers, Hasbro saw that as a company they could not afford the risk to push this system to market. Because Nemo games would also cost potentially millions of dollars to produce, the option of selling the hardware at a loss just wasn't something Hasbro could do. Had factors outside of Hasbro's control not occurred, the control vision could have very well shifted the gaming landscape of the early 90s. A new video game console war could have erupted with companies vying for a piece of the new FMV frontier opening up. A patent was filed for an interactive video system with very similar capabilities to the Nemo. The console used RCA's video disc technology to achieve a similar gameplay mechanic, with multiple tracks on video discs allowing for potentially more advanced gameplay. Had the Nemo/Control Vision hit the market at $100, other players would have been quick to follow because others were already waiting to do it. Ultimately, the Nemo never hit store shelves. The great video console war never happened. The games created for the Nemo had to sit in a warehouse waiting for a system just powerful enough to play them. The Sega CD. Thank you for watching Historicnerd today. If you enjoyed this content, please go over and check out Junkball Media. He has some outstanding content. And also, go check out Houdini Fontmeister, a relatively small new channel. Go check him out as well. Thank you very much for watching this episode today, and I hope you have a wonderful evening, day, or night, or whatever it is you're doing. Bye.